that I'm calling in from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, recognizing sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We're very fortunate to have such esteemed panelists and a moderator this evening. We're really excited to introduce them and to let you have a fascinating conversation tonight. We're unfortunately less excited about the circumstances under which we meet. I want to particularly acknowledge that so many in my community, in the Jewish community, are deeply, deeply fearful right now. Anti-Semitic attacks are at a record high. They are very worrying. People are fearing for their own personal safety, and we're so grateful to have people here to address those concerns and to speak to them tonight. So I want to recognize those concerns. I want to say that we are stronger when we are together, and I want to thank you all for being here. I want to say, just like we in the Jewish community are so appreciative for our Christian, for our Muslim, for our non-faith, our many different brothers and sisters who are speaking out against anti-Semitism, so too is it critical that we in the Jewish community speak out against Islamophobia. We must speak out against racism. We must speak out against hatred in any form. We know that we are only going to defeat these hatreds because they are all connected when we fight all of them together. We must fight this extremism and fight against violence and show that we are united in social cohesion in a view to a betterment of our Australian society. So thank you for being here for this conversation. I'm incredibly excited to introduce tonight's moderator, who will introduce our guests. Geraldine Doogue is our moderator for this evening. She's a renowned Australian journalist and broadcaster, much respected for her work reporting on religious and social affairs and on Australia's place in the world. Geraldine has carved out an enviable reputation across print, television and radio, starting on the West Australian in Perth, before moving to the Australian, ABC's Nationwide, 2UE, Channel 10 News, hosting ABC TV's Compass program, and continuing in various roles on ABC RN and via podcasting. In 2000, she was awarded a Churchill Fellowship on Social and Cultural Reporting. In 2003, she was honoured with the title of Officer in the Order of Australia, AO, for distinguished service to the community and related to ethics, values, religion, and social change. In 2018, she was delighted to be admitted to the Australian Media Hall of Fame and has been awarded several honorary doctorates by Australian universities. Geraldine, thank you for being on this evening. I'll hand it over to you to introduce our guests.
Thank you, Michael, very much indeed, and welcome everybody. It is lovely to be here. The other thing that Michael didn't say is that I am known to be an optimist. So I bring that particular quality. My colleague, Hamish MacDonald on Global Roaming, often accuses me of being an optimist. I must say my optimism has been somewhat challenged of late, but the sort of the sensibility I would like to bring tonight is for us to look to our strengths as well. I won't be dodging things because we have your questions. We've got a range of good demanding questions that were filed before we began on invitation. So I don't intend to dodge things, but I don't intend to just dwell on what has gone wrong. I want to really try to work out where we do have strengths that we may not have realised. And I was quite struck by a quote that was in the Sun Herald that is produced in Sydney, but I know goes over quite a wider range of Australia, by Tali Bleebow, who was a former Director of Strategic Intelligence and Capabilities at the New South Wales Crime Commission. And she's joined this new DOOR Foundation that Josh Frydenberg has set up to tackle anti-Semitism and really trying to stop, from what I read, the targeting of Jewish Australians online and at university. But she said, it wasn't her, it was another woman, the former Australasian Union of Jewish Students Vice President Zachary Morris, a man, said this week, a lot of attention had been paid to punishing anti-Semitic acts, including the passage of national hate speech laws last week, but not enough on preventing anti-Semitic attitudes from forming. We have been addressing the symptoms, but not the underlying pathologies. And it was actually Tar Hill who said, how did we get to the point where people in Australia can harbour these views and share them online? How can we prevent those views from being formed in the first place? So look, that's the sort of emphasis that I'm going to try to bring, and you can argue with me. I'm quite happy for you to do so, but that's what intrigues me about where we are. How the heck can we alert people to the dangers of this spiraling, but also encourage them to reconfigure some of these various anguish that is on display? And I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by Anne Aly, who's the member for Cowan since 2016. She's the Minister for Youth and Early Childhood Education, also assisting the Minister for the NDIS. She was born in Egypt, came here as a toddler, and has specialised in countering violent extremism, and set up in 2021 the PAVE, founded the People Against Violent Extremism, particularly aimed at youth. I'd also like to welcome Zali Steggall, who's the MHR for Warringah since 2019, my seat as it turns out, though I had nothing to do with this choice. A very successful athlete, as I think a lot of you know, and very active. I think we've seen Zali very active in the Parliament in discussing these issues and in trying to be a rational voice. So I welcome you both. Thank you very much for being with us. So now, look, we've looked at, I think, individual and collective attitudes have been on display. Can I ask you both this? What have you decided Australia has going for it in trying to challenge these tense moments? Like, you can go into where it isn't working that out well, but what strengths do we have to bring to this debate? First to you, Zali.
Okay, well, thank you, Geraldine, and welcome everyone. This is a really important conversation to be having, because I know so many people are incredibly distressed and worried in our communities. And so it's really important. And I think that feeds into the answer to this question, Geraldine, is that we talk about it and we address it. I think that's one of our strengths as a country. We do address more often than not head-on issues within our communities, and I think we still have a bit of maturing to do when it comes to looking at racism, anti-Semitism, issues that we don't generally like to associate with ourselves, but I think we're really being forced to have this conversation, and it's really important that we have it. For too long, I think there's been that kind of simmering prejudice that has been under the surface. And look, I think a lot of it probably erupted a little bit with the referendum last year around Indigenous recognition, around also COVID. You know, we've seen this polarisation within our communities, and this kind of, it's a really concerning growth of that kind of otherness and people feeling very siloed in their groups, and then that vilifies and grows that simmering prejudice, and we're really seeing it erupt now with the rise of anti-Semitism, but historically we've had it also in other areas. So I think our strength is that we have, as a fairly young democracy, we're capable of calling it out. We're frank-spoken, I think, as a nation. We can do this. But I think it's also our Achilles heel that we haven't really acknowledged racism and underlying prejudice, especially religious prejudice. Sorry, that's probably not a word. Religious prejudice. We haven't called it out clearly enough for some time.
Well, of course, it was rampant in the earlier part of the last century between the Catholics and the Protestants, and it was most definitely vivid and very blunt. And it was, but it was all, it was white, of course. It was all within the white. It was like a civil war within the white communities, I suppose. So, I mean, we have been here before, and we did move beyond it. Maybe this is new language, new repertoire required now. I'll just ask you that finally before I go to Anne.
Absolutely, but I think there's also sensitivities. We're seeing a rise of far right, politically speaking, around the world, and so that brings incredible fear, I think, for many communities. During COVID and lockdowns, we saw protests, like in Victoria, where you saw the rise of the use of the Nazi symbol, and so these are all things that are incredibly challenging, I think, for the community. And then obviously with foreign conflicts has brought incredible distress locally. And now the rise of anti-Semitism is really challenging and really has to be addressed. And I do agree with that statement you started with, which is we can look at the tough measures from a dealing with the symptoms, but we need to look to the underlying cause to make sure we really genuinely address it.
And Anne, what would you, as a specialist in this area, what strengths do we bring? Where are we wanting?
So, first of all, thank you for this great panel, and it's a great opportunity to harness some of the strengths that we have, and I'll get to those in a minute. But I do want to start by saying a few years ago I wrote an article, and the article was called Tomorrow's Villains, and it basically charted the kind of the simmering tensions and racism in Australian society going way, way back. And the way in which minorities and others were often couched in the language of the landscape. They were seen to come and flood. It was an invasion. They were a peril. And that throughout the years, the villain in this changed. And, you know, I ended this article with the question of who will be tomorrow's villains, who will be the next, the next group that is a threat, a peril, poised to invade Australia and challenge our way of life. So I want to say that there is this kind of deep vein of racism that throbs through the heart of Australia and occasionally raises its ugly head with simmering tensions that we've never actually addressed in the history of this country. Our social cohesion remains quite fragile and something that we consistently need to monitor. Now, Geraldine, like you, I like to think of myself as an optimist who's often challenged by pessimist thinking as well. But I do see optimism, and you asked me about where our strengths are here, and our strengths are our people. Our strengths are our people and our people-to-people connections. Now, when you look at social cohesion, it's often a term that's spoken about a lot. But when you look at the definition of social cohesion, and I use here, I think it's the OECD definition of social cohesion, it has three components to it. One component is trust between people. The other is trust between people and the institutions that govern them. And the third is social capital. But that trust between people is I think one of our greatest strengths here in Australia. People's trust of the institutions that govern them, particularly politics, has waned over the years, and there's enough data out there to show us that people don't trust politics as much, or the media as much as they used to. But people-to-people trust, I think, is one of our greatest strengths. And when we talk about prevention, the prevention is not the onus of a government or the onus of a particular person. It's the onus of all of us through those people-to-people connections that we make.
And do you actually feel that the past few weeks, well, it's more than a few weeks now, have changed the Australian community or its sense of itself? Yes.
I think it's challenged and it's put up a mirror to the Australian community a bit about, you know, how much do we actually tolerate racism? You know, it's got us questioning how much do we actually tolerate racism when we're seeing these things, you know, play out in front of our eyes. What kind, and we should be questioning what kind of a society are we that it gets to this point. So I think I see, you know, the optimist in me sees this as an opportunity to finally confront racism in all its forms, and an opportunity to build that social cohesion, that trust between people. But it takes a concerted effort, and it takes people who are willing to put their head above the parapet and to speak out against it. I'll tell you this, Geraldine, every single time that I spoke out against far-right extremism, I got death threats, hate mail, and I had to be escorted to and from my car. This was when I was working at the university as a researcher who had the empirical evidence, had to be escorted to and from my car. Okay? So yeah, I think what we're seeing now, yes, it's horrific, but can we also use it as an opportunity? Can we use it as an opportunity to build those people-to-people connections that are the fabric of social cohesion, what weaves together and creates that mesh of social cohesion?
Yes, it's interesting because I would have thought, Zali, that really it's the opportunity to take note of whether there is sufficient understanding of what's underway with this extraordinary dramas that we're living through in world events. People have got a right to be frightened. I think I'm frightened in a whole lot of ways. It's what you do with your fear, I would suggest to you. And so I don't think people ought to be criticised for being frightened. It's what are the sort of sanctions that apply in multicultural societies in particular, with soft underbellies, I would have thought. In fact, I think we do very well in a whole lot of ways. But maybe there are some new codes, sort of some new principles that need to apply. I wonder if you've thought about that.
Well, yeah, well, look, I definitely agree that there's definitely never a question of questioning people's fear. Fear is very real within members of our community. I've had members write to me, you know, obviously with their children frightened of going to school, and the rise in the violence of incidents has been incredibly challenging. I guess the question is, how do we address it? In terms of, there's always that, it's that question of the blame, or what's the cause, or what's the underlying cause. And it's, I think it is fear. It is also always trying to, I guess, take advantage. You know, there's a lot of distress in our communities. As you mentioned, we've got a lot going on worldwide, and that infiltrates within our communities, and then that has an impact, and people on various ends of belief, or sort of, guess, concerns of conflicts, have exacerbated that level of genuine distress within our communities, and that is dangerous, which are, as a representative, we've been briefed a number of times by ASIO and others around that need as leaders to really monitor our language, make sure we're not inflaming the situation. You know, it's always, it's very, you know, looking to blame others, or to who is blaming or responsible, rather than really looking at root causes. But also, socially, we have to acknowledge or recognise there's a really dangerous trend happening, and we were briefed again from Asia around the increasing radicalisation of youth, and the rising level of concern around that. And it is not always linked to, I guess, religious radicalisation. It is actually social radicalisation that's occurring mostly with young men, around a rejection of usual order. You know, there's a lot of elements to it, but it's at a level that they've not seen before. And so it leads to a higher level of violence, or a higher level of, you know, these incidents are so much more extreme than what we would hope would be visible within our community. Like, this is just not the Australia we want to have. So
the normal restraints that we would have expected aren't working.
Well, I think Australia, as one of the most successful multicultural nations, we have an incredible amount of diversity in Australia. We have incredible communities. You know, we are a land of opportunity for many, with an underlying problem. As I said, you know, we don't recognise our first Australians, so we have an underlying scar to our nation, I do believe. And so you have this environment with a lot of different communities bringing, you know, maybe historical and a lot of issues and concerns. And so we have to be very mindful of that and make sure there's room for everyone to express their distress, their happiness or unhappiness about what's happening, without always turning to blame or looking at, just for me, I've found it incredibly challenging, Geraldine, I've got to say, as a member of parliament. It's been a really difficult time these last 2 years to navigate the distress in our community, and how do we keep us together, because ultimately the extreme views win if we become if we lose our unity within the community.
Yeah, that Timothy Snyder, that American thinker who's written about tyranny that arrives, sort of autocracy that arrives, and he says the major problem is preemptively buckling. You're making sure that you stay on course is one of, in your own little way, just staying on course and not giving in.
Yeah, and what's been really interesting is I've had members of our community, Jewish Australians of our community, really caught in how to manage or how to have their voice recognised within extreme concern and distress around world events, as well as concern around safety and anti-Semitism. And for them to have their legitimate voice heard, they've also found that really difficult, and then of course we've had the very loud other voices as well. So it has been an incredibly challenging time, but I'm an optimist as well. I think we all can grow from that, as long as we're taking the necessary safety steps.
And Anne, I've been a bit surprised, I'll be perfectly honest, that I haven't heard more real use of Australian iconography in our history, almost saying to people quite invitingly, when you come here, whoever you are, my relatives came from Ireland, you leave those implacable, unsolved issues that you left at home, and you would join a different type of conversation in this new democracy as opposed to an ancient land. And this is the great compact, really high-flown rhetorical language. This is the glittering prize on offer in Australia. We haven't heard that sort of invitation. I don't understand why not.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying there, Geraldine. And, obviously I'm a migrant, first generation migrant, and was very much raised in that way by my parents as well. And, we were raised to have, of course, we had a lot of pride in our history and our culture and our traditions. And, I still say, Egyptian blood runs through my veins. I was born, wasn't born in Australia, but I'm certainly born of Australia. And I think that what I find quite interesting is you have young people who are third or fourth generation. I'm first generation, but you have young people who are third or fourth generation who are particularly involved in conflicts that are happening overseas, and that is impacting on them in Australia. Now, I don't quite understand it. I've thought about it. I've given a lot of thought, Geraldine, because for me, once my parents made Australia home, Australia was home. And whilst we still had a lot of love for the mother country and our homeland, I watch Egyptian shows, I listen to Egyptian songs, I grew up with them, right? My interests and my focus are in a future in Australia for my children, my grandchildren, hopefully one day, who knows, great-grandchildren and so forth. So I find that quite interesting. I think it's part of this kind of, Zali mentioned the radicalization of young people, and young people have always been quite a target for radicalization, but I think it's disturbing that it's younger and younger, and that it's much more self-directed and much more cherry-picking different ideologies that match a particular circumstance or particular thought process that they have in their heads as well. So there needs to be a lot of focus on the youth And how are youth identifying themselves? Where is their identity here? Particularly for young people who may be third, fourth, fifth generation, second or third.
Well, maybe there are major identity issues. Maybe that's what we should get to, which are complicated, or, could do with Andrew Tate, for instance. I mean, if it's young men, it may have nothing to do with, whole formation of self.
I do believe there are very complicated identity issues. And, your teenage years are those critical years where you're trying to figure out your place in the world and who you are and what your identity is. And group belonging is huge for you as a young person. Who do I belong to? Which group? Wanting what we call ontological security, the security that you get from being part of a bigger group, part of something. And so young people are finding ontological security through these, echo chambers and rabbit holes that they're going down, largely facilitated by social media and the internet, largely self-directed, and it's dangerous, and it's a worrying trend.
So how do we get, what is ASIO, what you can say, Zali? I mean, this is very interesting, I think. Maybe we are getting closer to causes. How does one deal with the social media inflammation?
Well, that is a big one. Look, I guess my colleague Zoe Daniel has put forward a duty of care private members bill around social media platforms, where really to get behind, pull back the curtain on social media platforms and the algorithm, right? The algorithm is the most dangerous element because they provide this self-feeding kind of system where harm is increased and emphasized, and there's no objectivity at the information people are then exposed to. So I think we are desperately needing some guardrails around social media, and with all respect to Anne, we have not even begun to touch the surface with the steps the government did around age limits to social media and those kind of things. It really has to be around the harm and so needing the guardrails when it comes to social media platforms and the information, because we are a global world where people are having access more than any other generation to so much influence from other countries and information, and things are distorted, right? Facts are distorted so easily. Images are distorted from incidents, from overseas conflicts. We know, and yet an image can inflame and really drive impressions, and especially impressionable young minds as well. And so that, leads to the blaming, the ostracizing, the discrimination. And so it's a real pressure cooker that then comes out socially in these kind of, you just would not have thought that we would see this kind of blow up of anti-Semitism, these kind of real domestic terrorism. When you look at, the synagogue fire, the kind of incidents we've had of late. This is domestic terrorism that just have no place in our society. But we have had other incidents of this kind of nature before, but maybe they haven't been as amplified by social media as they can now be. So that's why it's so important to have the guardrails, and I think it must be a real priority of government after this election, whoever is in government, to focus on this, because it is incredibly dangerous. And then it's also, ultimately from the briefings we've had, is around that responsibility you have to take in relation to these issues. There has to be some issues that are above politics, right? There has to be, when it comes to safety and cohesion within our communities, must be above politics. But I would argue we haven't seen that in the last few years.
So you mean and you're implying bipartisanship must enter the picture?
I would say multi-partisanship, Geraldine.
Well, quite. Okay. Sorry, Zali.
This isn't just about, the views from, I really feel there has to be issues of overall cohesion and safety that must be above politics, but I don't think that's the case. I think we are seeing the politicisation of distress and discrimination, and to me that is incredibly dangerous for us as a country.
Yes, a couple of things strike me. So that sort of question of, that's the assumption you're making is there are some things that can spiral out of control. Now, that's not necessarily being accepted as widely as I thought it was, the notion that things can spiral and therefore you take more care. But as you're speaking, I was thinking, that maybe we need really clever sort of behaviour change programs, almost like we've had with road safety, in terms of the way people use social media to think about how they change while watching. And that whole business of learning how to hold yourself together as a person who might be being heavily influenced and not descend into something that you actually come to loathe, look of yourself. I wonder if the people are starting to think cleverly about that sort of response.
Absolutely, but I think language matters, right? Language matters of what words you use to describe situations. Respect, the lack of respect we have in some areas of society, and we see it across so many issues. And what starts with a lack of respect leads to greater levels of violence until ultimately they are outright acts of domestic terrorism, right? So we need to go all the way back to the source of language and respect and understanding. I mean, we always talk about seek to understand before being understood, of being willing to listen to. All areas of our communities aren't going to agree on everything, but at least having the respect to having the conversation. Yeah. But sometimes it's incredibly hard to do that.
See, Anne, I just got today across my email from the Australian National Imams Council, ANIC, alerting me to what they called as the heinous and barbaric attacks on 2 Muslim women at the Epping Shopping Centre in Victoria. And they thought there was a terrible escalation of Islamophobic violence targeted at innocent people. And they wanted to make sure that in all the discussion about anti-Semitism, that some of the other examples of lack of respect, to say the very least, weren't overlooked. So I just wonder, so then you start to sort of be a dueling victims. I don't know quite where that takes us, but clearly this is important that everybody is acknowledged.
Well, I'll say this. I met with my local Jewish community here, and they spoke to me very frankly about the fear that they felt and some of the things that they've experienced.
This is in Perth?
In Perth. Mm. And it reminded me of after Christchurch.
Oh, right.
And my faith community, Muslims were fearful to go to their place of worship. And it reminded me of after 9/11, when, Muslim women were fearful of being seen in public wearing their hijab. And it reminded me of being a young mother to teenage boys, begging them not to run through the train station with their backpacks after the London bombings. So, and to use my own experience and the experience of my community to have empathy for Jewish Australians, I think is not an unextraordinary thing. I think it's something that you expect, that people who have been through something have empathy for those who are going through it now. And so whilst I think that we should be tackling all forms of racism and all forms of radicalization and the different drivers of that, there are times when we need to acknowledge that there is a section of the community that is feeling fear, feeling pain, feeling hurt, and that we have the capacity to empathize with that section of the community and stand up for that section of the community in the same way that we would want people to empathize and stand with us.
Even if you don't have a natural affinity, you're saying, even if you don't have a natural affinity with that group.
Well, that's the issue. Why wouldn't I have a natural affinity with another faith group? We're all part of, Christians, Muslims, Jews, we're all the Abrahamic faiths. We have an affinity through the connection of our monotheism, our monotheistic religions and Abrahamic faith. So there is an affinity that exists there. What I'm saying is that we should be able to draw on our own experiences and say, I understand because this happened to us as well, and I don't want it to happen to you. I don't want the things that I went through, or my family went through, or my children went through. I don't want Jewish Australians to go through that. I don't want that for them. So if I don't want that for me, then I shouldn't want that for anyone else.
I think it's also, sorry, Jordan, it's really, we've got to be also very mindful. This is not a reciprocal situation where we know there is all forms of racism in Australia, right? I mean, even calling it out became controversial for me. But the question, just because I think it's important not to legitimize one community by always having to reference other communities that experience it as well in some other way. And I know that's been an area of, I guess, unhappiness, like a sort of distress as well, that because at the moment anti-Semitism is, so I guess has really become so, has increased to such an extent now that there's so much fear and concern.
316% since October the 7th.
Exactly. So it's a huge increase. It does not diminish that there's been other racism and other incidents, but I think always trying to create an equivalent or having both at the same, mentioning all forms of racism at the same time, then creates a sense of is the Jewish community's concern only legitimised if it can be also made relevant with other forms of racism that have occurred. And it's not to diminish any of the other racism that I'm sure Muslim community have experienced, what Anne was just sharing. But I think it's just really important for one community to be able to express their distress without always needing to be legitimised through acknowledging the other areas of incidents that occur.
Yes, like we did. Well, I'm going to go to questions now, but we did have a question. The Lebanese community has written an open letter asking that incidents of Islamophobia not be ignored in the focus on anti-Semitism. How do we ensure that we focus on all incidents of this kind of racism post-October the 23 while maintaining a key focus on the anti-Semitic incidents that appear to be at a level of violence and malice we've rarely seen in Australia in modern times? So I suppose it's a pretty good overview question, I think, that, Anne. It's maintaining joint, focuses, which is what I think is particularly interesting in terms of things being above politics, maybe, and the language used. I'll just go to another question. Does the overlap between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism contribute to increasing social tensions? Now, what are your thoughts about that, Anne?
Yeah, I often hear people putting forth the argument that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. But I think, I don't think we need it takes a lot to recognize rampant Jew hatred when you see it. And I think that sometimes this argument is brought about as a kind of a whataboutism type argument, or to kind of downplay some of the anti-Semitism that we've seen. And so I think that when we talk about anti-Semitism, what we're actually getting at here, Geraldine, is the fact that the hatred against Jewish Australians has been conflated with what Israel is doing, right? With the situation in Israel, and being able to separate that, I think, is a key point here. Separating the Australian Jewish community from the actions of the Israeli government or the IDF is the key point here. And
which takes a bit of intellectual effort, doesn't it?
Well, does it? I just think I think it's common sense. I mean, I see comments on social media that say, well, this is because of what Israel is doing. How is that even logical? Because of what Israel is doing, the Australian Jewish community deserves to be targeted in this way. How is that? To me, it doesn't make sense. But perhaps it doesn't make sense to me because I lived through Islamophobia in the wake of 9/11, where everyone was saying, well, the Muslims deserve it because of 9/11, right? So perhaps it doesn't make sense to me because of that.
So you saw the irrationality up close.
Yeah, absolutely. To me, it's an irrational argument to say it's because of what Israel is doing. The Australian Jewish community is not the Israeli government.
And Zali, how what's your response to that? Because I mean, in some ways, that's the core. You know, if there were good explanations for this, I think it would help.
Yeah, of course, and it's incredibly difficult because we have people within our communities who have direct, family or relatives or felt obviously the horror of the October 7 terrorist attack and the hostage taking led to an incredible level of aggression and distress for many within our community around the plight of those hostages. Then we also have within our community members who have family, Palestinians with family in Gaza who are either now, obviously in horrific situations and circumstances and with high levels of casualty. So you have two very valid levels of incredible distress, and how that then is recognised in a careful way, and the two are not irreconcilable, right? I think the two are incredibly valid responses, but it's trying to there's room for both. So I'm not expressing myself very clearly.
No, because it's too hard. I envy people who can express themselves clearly. I think, well, lucky you, because often it's very facile conclusion drawing, I might add.
Exactly, and for example, the need unequivocally to call for example, hostage releases, and that obviously it was an aggression, and so for Jewish Australians to be entitled to and feel strongly about that incident and the conflict and the nature of it, at the same time as, for example, being then concerned still of the humanitarian crisis that's unfolded in relation to Palestinian people and the atrocious level of civilian casualties. So it is incredibly complex. And it's trying to grapple with it. So I've met, for example, with the Israeli ambassador to talk about anti-Semitism and social cohesion in Australia, trying to separate it out from the actions of what's happening in foreign conflict. I've met with the National Anti-Racism Commissioner, and even asking question time the Prime Minister and the Minister around the National Anti-Racism Framework, which didn't get much airplay from the government. And maybe you can give us a bit more on that, because that was a really important document that looked at that underlying racism and prejudice that we have that simmers away, and then conflicts or incidents can really bubble it up to the surface. And if we never really get to the causes, we will always be at risk of this happening. And so that National Anti-Racism Framework is incredibly important, but yet has really not had much prominence, I would say. How many people know we have a new anti-racism framework report that has a lot of very important recommendation of actions that are needed?
Before I go to Anne, Parnell Palme McGuinness wrote quite an interesting column in the Sun Herald yesterday, having spoken about when she lived in Berlin years ago and actually moved to the pretty challenged parts of Berlin and found herself in groups that she may not have necessarily lived among if she was living in Australia. And she she was saying, the very interesting challenge, I think, Anne Aly, we're lucky, she wrote, that social media is bringing issues that were once hidden to the surface. Australia's vast expanses make accidentally stumbling across a culture clash that might shock you less likely. And that actually what we may have seen with this ghastly discussion about the nurses is a huge shock, but in its own way, useful as a sort of a reminder, a catalyst for us to actually have a broader discussion about language, about what should be beyond the pale, about, restraint, etc. I wonder what you think about that.
I think it's kind of like what you said earlier, Geraldine, about, it's what you do with fear, right? Because the fear response either holds you in, renders you unable to move, or it pushes you into action. So it's kind of like can we use this as a catalyst? Can we use this as a catalyst and a reminder and a point of discussion and a way in which we can talk about that underlying simmering racism and how did we get here? Well, we've been here, right? How did Australia get to where we are? Well, we've been where we are before, but it's been different groups, and so here we are now. Can this be the last? Can we now put a red line here and go enough, right? I think, and I think it is that. I do think though that the media has a huge role to play here. And I know, Zali, we talk about like multi-partisanship on this, but the media undermines that so much. So much it undermines it.
How primarily does it do that?
Oh, I've got enough research and data and articles that I wrote about how the media does that, Geraldine, but let me try and summarize it in as little as I can. Even the placing of articles next to each other, the pictures next to each other, the way in which the language that the media uses, this abhorrent thing that the Daily Telegraph went and did, where they sent out these journalists with the cameras to Cairo Cafe. Why would you do? Why would anyone do that? It is irresponsible of the media in the way in which they deal with this. And
well, it's mischievous, actually. It's dead set mischievous.
I find it just irresponsible. And when we talk about the Muslim community, the LMA you mentioned as well, the grievance that I'm hearing from the Muslim community is that the reporting in the media is imbalanced. Right, that there is no reporting on similar incidences that happen where Muslims are the target, right? And I can have some sympathy with that, but I can also remember after the Christchurch bombings, how I went to my local mosque and there were people from all over the community coming with flowers and really showing that love for the Muslim community in their time of grief and need. Now we can do the same for another community in their time of
many
grief.
of whom would have been Jewish people working interface.
Exactly. So can we use this as a catalyst? Yeah, but you know what? It's up to every single one of us. All of us can do this if we band together and have the power that we have, the agency that we have as individuals to overcome a media that is trying to divide, a media that is doing things like what the Daily Telegraph did, a media that is after the clickbait, a media that believes if it bleeds it leads, and we need to rise above that.
Let me just look at the first question that came through, and it goes back to where we've been, but how do we deal with social media, particularly TikTok, was the questioner, as a weapon for amplification of misinformation, hate speech, and antisocial behaviour? So I wonder if you have come across, Zali, some good examples of people who are trying to be very proactive and cute and clever in the way they, harnessing real creativity to hit back in often maybe a witty way? Like, have you seen this or not?
It's hard. Look, Australia traditionally uses humour well, I think, and to deal with challenging situations. But I don't think this is one where humour can really work, because it's so distressing and it goes to the heart. And TikTok is difficult, but it's not just TikTok. I think Twitter and other platforms are incredibly damaging, and they feed on this idea of the clickbait on outrage, and the more outrageous the statement is, the more the more traction it gets, the more shares it gets,
lots of
and
emotion.
it triggers emotions, and that triggers responses, and facts and reality are so far removed from some of this content that it's just incredibly dangerous. And unfortunately, I think our legacy media, some elements of it are falling into this pattern of looking for the sensationalism. I mean, media has always liked sensationalism. It sells, right? We can talk about that. But, entering into this, it's a really ethically difficult territory of, entrapment around to get a story, to create sensationalism. That is, it's morally repugnant, but I actually would argue illegal. The Daily Telegraph incident, to me, that is entrapment to lead someone into committing. Ironically, with the laws we've now passed, that is leading people to commit a crime that have very serious consequences. And so what, I guess, legal ramifications should travel with anyone trying to incite that to happen. There should be responsibility for that as well. So I agree. I think the media carries a huge responsibility, and the media now encompasses all our social media platforms, TikTok and Twitter and all of that, where we see the growth of hate and misinformation really grow. And that comes back to that duty of care. We need to pull back the curtain on the algorithm and how that works, the silo it creates, a self kind of fulfilling silo of misinformation and hate, which is just so incredibly dangerous.
Do no harm. I mean, I don't see why that couldn't be applied to the media. If it's applied to medicine, I can't see why it can't be. That's tricky. I understand more than anybody. Yes, Anne.
I just want to make a point here about the social media, because all the kind of what we talk about online radicalization starts with particular behavior, and that behavior is seeking behavior, right? So you imagine
what behavior? Seeking,
right? So there's a progression of behaviors that starts with seeking. So someone has a question, what do? You Google it, right? And then depending on the algorithms that come back to you, you'll get different answers, different responses. Now, not everyone will go from being a seeker and progress through the different online behaviors to an actor, to someone who is fully radicalized and ready to commit.
In fact, it's quite unusual, isn't it? Quite unusual.
It is, and it's not a linear progression either. People come in and out. But what we do is, if you start with that seeking behavior and you have a question, say about, something that a white supremacist group said, or something that Andrew Tate said, or whatever, and you Google that, okay? So if you have the content that comes at you is only one-sided, you are more likely to go down that little rabbit path, that little rabbit hole of radicalization, and progress down through those behaviors to acting behavior. One of the things that we can do in this space is to get young people to be content creators, and then work on the algorithms that when somebody Googles something about migrants, or about Jewish Australians, or about Muslims, or about any point at which is an entry point into a radicalizing narrative, that there is an alternative narrative for them.
Precisely.
And so this was work that like some of the social media platforms were actually quite active in this space, in training and funding young content creators to create material and content that challenged online hate, that challenged the kinds of ideological statements and content that was coming out of some of the far right, or some of the more radical ideological groups that were forming online.
Good. Well, that's exactly what I wanted to hear. and I really believe these sorts of proactive, constructive suggestions that look small but actually could have outsized impacts where we ought to go. And because we've got to stop. But that, and all the work that I have done over the years when I was working on Life Matters, and we had earlier iterations of, in the 90s and so on, of terrorism, the move for a person, so that a person could do lots of hate speech, but the move to actually become active was a huge psychological decision. And that was your point of entry to that young man, usually a man, and that was exactly where the police, people like the AFP and ASIO were working, which I always felt was very good to know about. All right, look, I know I'm being given the wind up. That was, I hope everybody agrees. I think that was a very rewarding conversation. I'm sorry I didn't get to all the questions, so I got to most in one way or the other.